On a freezing morning in December 1849, a 27-year-old writer stood in a square in St. Petersburg, tied to a wooden post, staring down the barrels of a firing squad. He had already said his goodbyes. He had already made peace, or tried to, with the fact that in the next few seconds his life would end. And then, at the very last possible moment, an officer rode up waving a piece of paper, and everything stopped. That writer's name was Fyodor Dostoevsky. 17 years later, he would write one of the greatest novels ever produced about guilt, punishment, and the terrifying weight of taking a life. And almost nobody talks about the fact that he understood that weight because he had already stood on the other side of it, waiting to die for a crime he hadn't even committed. This isn't really a story about a novel. It's a story about what happens to a mind that has already died once, in every way except the literal one, and then has to keep living. To understand what happened in that square, you have to go back a few years earlier. By the mid-1840s, Dostoevsky was a young, promising writer in St. Petersburg, and like a lot of young intellectuals of his generation, he started attending meetings of a discussion group that met on Friday evenings. It was led by a man named Mikhail Petrushevsky, and the group talked about literature, philosophy, and increasingly, politics. They read banned books. They discussed the abolition of serfdom. They criticized the Russian autocracy, carefully, the way people do when they know they're being watched, except they weren't careful enough. In April 1949, the Russian secret police arrested more than 30 members of the group, Dostoevsky among them. He was held in the Peter and Paul fortress for 8 months while the case against him was built. The charge, essentially, was conspiracy against the state. The evidence was mostly the fact that he had read a banned letter out loud at one of the meetings. In November 1849, a military court sentenced Dostoevsky and several others to death by firing squad. On December 22nd, the prisoners were taken from their cells before dawn and driven through the freezing streets of St. Petersburg to Semyonovskaya Square. They were made to stand on a scaffold while the charges and the sentence were read aloud, in full, in the cold. Then they were divided into groups of 3, and the first 3 men were tied to posts and had white hoods pulled over their heads. Dostoevsky was in the next group. He had somewhere between a few seconds and a few minutes left to live, and he knew it with total certainty. He later described trying to memorize everything around him in those final moments, the light on a nearby church dome, the faces of the men beside him, as if some part of his mind refused to stop working even while the rest of him was preparing to die. And then, at exactly that moment, a horseman arrived carrying an order from the Tsar. The execution was never real. It was staged, deliberately, as a psychological punishment, designed and approved in advance by the government itself, to be halted at the very last second. The men would not be shot. Instead, they would be sent to Siberia. One of the prisoners in the group, a young man named Grigoriev, lost his mind on the spot and never fully recovered. Dostoevsky did not lose his mind, but something in him changed permanently in that square, in a way he would spend the rest of his life writing about, directly or indirectly. He later wrote to his brother, in a letter sent just hours after the reprieve, that he did not feel sad and that his soul had not perished. He wrote that this experience taught him things worth more than the price he had nearly paid them for. But he also wrote something else, something quieter, something that stayed with him. That a person condemned to die and then given life back at the final second does not simply return to the life he had before. He becomes someone who has already crossed the line once and knows exactly what waits on the other side of it. From St. Petersburg, Dostoevsky was sent in chains across the frozen expanse of Russia to a prison camp in Omsk, in Siberia. He would spend the next 4 years there, sentenced to hard labor alongside murderers, thieves, and violent criminals, most of whom had actually done what they were convicted of. The conditions were brutal. He worked breaking bricks and hauling materials in temperatures that regularly fell below -30. He slept in overcrowded barracks. He was allowed almost no privacy, no solitude, nothing to read except a single copy of the New Testament, which prisoners were permitted to keep, and which he read obsessively, cover to cover, for years. It was also in this period that his epilepsy, which may have existed in a milder form before, became severe and frequent, a condition that would follow him for the rest of his life and that would eventually work its way, transformed, into the minds of several of his most unforgettable characters. But something else happened at Omsk that mattered at just as much as the physical suffering. For the first time in his life, Dostoevsky, a member of the educated literary elite of St. Petersburg, was living in close, forced proximity with actual murderers, men who had killed, sometimes brutally, sometimes for almost no reason at all. And instead of simply being horrified by them, which he was, he became obsessed with understanding them. What did it feel like, from the inside, to have taken a life? What happened afterward in the mind of a person who had crossed that specific, irreversible line? He later called his years in Omsk the burial of my life, but he also called them the beginning of his real understanding of human nature. He was released from the labor camp in 1854, but was then required to serve several more years as a common soldier in a Siberian regiment, still technically exiled, still barred from publishing freely. He would not be allowed to return to European Russia and to his old literary life until the end of the decade. When Dostoevsky finally did return, he was not the same writer who had left. His earlier fiction had been sensitive, psychological, sometimes almost sentimental. What came after Siberia was different, harder, darker, obsessed with questions of guilt, suffering, and whether human beings could ever truly justify taking control over the life of another person, even in the name of some greater idea. For years after his return, Dostoevsky struggled financially. He gambled compulsively, losing money he didn't have in casinos across Europe. He took on crushing debts to support the dead brother's family and his own household. By the mid-1960s, he signed a genuinely reckless contract with a publisher named Stilovis, one that would strip him of the rights to his own work if he failed to deliver a new novel by an impossible deadline. It was in the middle of this financial and personal chaos, in 1865 and 1866, that he wrote Crime and Punishment. The novel follows a young former student named Raskolnikov who murders an elderly pawnbroker, convinced beforehand that he is intellectually and morally superior enough to justify the killing, that some human beings are simply permitted to cross lines that bind everyone else. And then Dostoevsky spends the rest of the novel showing, in unbearable psychological detail, exactly what happens inside a mind after it crosses that line for real. The guilt Raskolnikov feels isn't abstract or symbolic on the page. It reads like something the author had actually witnessed at close range, again and again for years in the barracks of a Siberian prison camp, listening to men who had actually killed try to live with what they'd done. Dostoevsky never committed murder, but he had stood, hooded, tied to a post, certain of his own death, close enough to it that the line between the condemned and the executed nearly disappeared for him completely, and he had then spent 4 years surrounded by men who lived permanently on the other side of a different but related line, men who had taken a life and had to keep living. Crime and Punishment was published serially through 1866, and it was an immediate and overwhelming success, both critically and commercially, unlike almost anything Dostoevsky had written before. It restored his reputation and eventually his finances, and it's now considered one of the foundational works of psychological fiction, studied and read continuously for more than 150 years. Here's the fact that stays with you. Dostoevsky wrote the most devastating literary portrait of guilt in the Russian language, arguably in any language, using knowledge that had cost him almost everything to acquire. 8 months in a fortress cell, a staged execution designed specifically to break him psychologically before sparing his life at the final second. 4 years of hard labor beside men who had actually killed, a form of epilepsy that would shape the rest of his life and work. He didn't choose any of that. The state did it, to him, deliberately as punishment for attending discussion groups and reading a banned letter out loud. But what he did afterward, he chose. He took the worst 2 years of his existence and turned them, over the following 17, into an understanding of the human mind so precise that readers still recognize themselves in it 150 years later. What does it mean that one of literature's deepest explorations of guilt was written by a man who had already stood, tied to a post,